Hello, everyone. We'll just wait a couple seconds for folks to come into the webinar. And we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum. I'm delighted to host tonight's program on behalf of our museum here in Hartford, Connecticut. I'll be introducing our guests more formally in just a moment, but first I want to thank our sponsors for this event. The Mark Twain House and Museum's virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away a few years ago. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs. We are also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting this and all our other programs. Now, let me formally introduce our guests. Tonight, we are welcoming a full panel of authors for a discussion of Classic Monsters Unleashed. It's a new anthology that reimagines, subverts, and pays homage to our favorite monsters and creatures. Our moderator is Alex Dueben. He is a freelance writer specializing in comics and poetry, books, and art. And now our panelists. Linda D. Addison is the author of 5 award-winning collections, including How to Recognize a Demon Has Become Your Friend. She is the recipient of the HWA Lifetime Achievement Award and SFPA Grandmaster of Fantastic Poetry. James Aquilone is the owner of Monstrous Books. He is the writer of the Dead Jack Zombie Detective series and editor of the anthologies Classic Monsters Unleashed, Shakespeare Unleashed, and Kolchak, the Night Stalker 50th Anniversary graphic novel. Goingback has been writing professionally for over 30 years. He is the author of numerous novels, children's books, screenplays, magazine articles, short stories, and comics. He is a 2-time Bram Stoker award winner, a Nebula Award nominee, and the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Horror Writers Association. His books include Crota, Darker Than Night, Evil Whispers, Breed, Shaman Moon, Coyote Rage, Eagle Feathers, The Gift, and Tribal Screams. In addition to writing under his own name, he has ghostwritten for Hollywood celebrities. Jonathan Maberry is a New York Times bestselling author. He is also 5-time Bram Stoker Award winner, 3-time Scribe Award winner, Inkpot Award winner, and comic book writer. His vampire apocalypse book series, V-Wars, was a Netflix original series. He writes horror, science fiction, epic fantasy, thriller, and more. He is the president of the International Association of Media Tie-in Writers and the editor of Weird Tales magazine. And finally, Rena Mason is an award-winning author. Her co-written screenplay, Rippers, was a 2014 staged 32. The Bloodlist presents the Search for New Blood Screenwriter Contest quarter finalist. She enjoys traveling, cooking, and spending time with her family. And she currently resides in a lakefront in the Great Lakes state of Michigan. Have a conversation in the chat along with our guests. If you have any specific question, you can post that directly into the Q&A section. Please also note that you can click on live transcript to see live auto captioning of this event. So that's it for me. So I'm gonna turn it over to Alex and our panelists. So please sit back and enjoy, and please don't forget to post your questions in the Q&A.
All right. Well, thank you, Omar, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight. We are here to talk about the new book, Classic Monsters Unleashed. Okay, that actually looks horrible from that angle, but and we're here with a bunch of writers who are known for writing horror. But there's a lot of overlap, but there's a lot of differences between a monster story and a horror story. In her 2017 book, My Favorite Thing is Monsters, Emile Ferris wrote about the difference between a good monster and a bad monster. A good monster sometimes gives somebody a fright because they're weird looking and fangy, a fact that is beyond their control. But bad monsters are all about control. They want the whole world to be scared. Which is a quote I just love. But I guess I'm just kind of curious for all of you. What was your first encounter with monsters and with these monsters that you wrote about in the book? James, do you want to start?
My first encounter with the classic monsters was probably with the Abbott and Costello movies. Probably watching that with my grandmother on like Sunday afternoons when that was like the only thing on TV. So that was my first encounter with them. And then I think even after that, it was probably like Young Frankenstein. So I think most of my classic monster exposure was through comedy. And then I came to the original movies, which is one of the reasons why I write like Dead Jack, Zombie Detective, who is a monster, but he's not bad, and it's comedy. So that's my approach. But I didn't write any of the stories in the book, so you don't have to worry about that.
What about the rest of you? Where did you first? What are your first monster stories?
My first encounters with monsters was at the ripe old age of 9 years old. My mother gave me my very first weekly allowance, a whopping 50 cents. And I lived in rural America, and she took me to the closest town, which had a population of 1,200 and only one four-way stop sign. There was no bookstores or toy stores, but it had a Rexall drugstore. I went into the Rexall, and there on the shelf was issue 51 of Famous Monsters of Filmland. I instantly fell in love with the magazine, the monsters, and all things spooky. And I've been a lifelong monster kid since then.
Well, I'll jump in since nobody else is talking. My introduction to monsters was actually folkloric monsters, not movie monsters. My grandmother, who was a wonderfully creepy old lady who believed in everything. If you can imagine Luna Lovegood from Harry Potter as an old lady, that's her. Believed in vampires, werewolves, ghosts, the whole bit. Loved her. And she introduced me to the folkloric versions of monsters, all over the world, different types of vampires and werewolves. And it was because of that I started looking, for them on TV and in movies and comics and so on. If she hadn't been such an influence on me, I would probably not have become a horror fan. But I started looking for, those monsters. And in Philadelphia, where I grew up, and I was born in the late 50s, grew up in the early 60s. We had a TV, every Friday night was Double Chiller Theater, a double feature of horror movies. And every Saturday afternoon was this weird double feature where you'd have one like sword and sandal gladiator film followed by a classic monster or science fiction film. So very shortly after the introduction I had from her, I was gobbling up all the monsters, the horror comics, my brother's old EC comics. Seemed like I went from 0 to 1,000 miles an hour with horror within a year or two.
Nice. I'm going to jump in now since you already said Philly. I grew up in Philly too, as Jonathan knows. And I was born in the early 50s. So I started watching Chiller Theater with my mom. And that was my first introduction. I think fondly of Frankenstein and the Mummy. Those are my two favorite. And then when I saw The Blob, I lost my mind because I thought, I want to do that. I want to be able to run over the whole planet and eat everything. Anyway, I think in so many ways that was the beginning of my connection to horror and being able to have that sort of darkness entertaining thing. So yeah, Chiller Theater.
For me, it was probably a little bit more traumatic when I was 4, even like before I'd started kindergarten. My aunt had come to live with us from overseas, and she would stay up late at night and watch scary movies. And I remember sneaking out one time, and the first movie that I ever saw was Godzilla. And I couldn't sleep for a couple of nights, and I remember it scared the pants off of me. And then the next weekend, I guess the weekend is when they showed the horror movies, I watched Christopher Lee's Dracula. And that one I couldn't sleep for a long while. And I just watched a bit of it and ran back to my room because it was so scary. And that was I couldn't sleep for the longest time, actually. And then as far as for the Mummy story, I think the inspiration for that came from the recent re-release, well, the more recent re-release of it with the Brendan Fraser. It was kind of like a family movie for us, and I really enjoyed it. So when the opportunity came around to write something for that, I jumped right on it.
Nice.
So James, you're the person behind this. Where did this idea come from of just getting people together and writing monster stories together?
This is one of those ideas I had for a long time, for like at least 15 years. That was like, that you put in the notes, and it's like, all right, I'm going to one day do this anthology. And I've been waiting years to, finally do my first anthology. And then, like 2020 happened, and things were crazy. And I finally decided, let me jump in and only do an anthology. And so I pulled this idea out, and I said, I think this is going to do pretty well on Kickstarter. And I pitched it to Crystal Lake Publishing, and they immediately said yes. And then I said, let me go to Jonathan, because if he says yes to this, then everyone else will probably say yes. And then he said yes, like almost immediately. And so then I knew that we were in, and pretty much everyone I contacted said yes. So everyone was like very much on board with this idea.
Well, and Jonathan, you were the reason for this, apparently. I mean, what made you, you're a monster fan, you're a horror writer. What makes you go, yes, let me tell a monster story?
Well, there are two reasons. Something James doesn't know. I also edit anthologies, and I was preparing my pitch for a classic monsters anthology. And literally that day, you emailed me, and I'm like, first, wow. And then I said yes. But okay. It's such a great idea. I'm amazed that nobody has done this before. And James put together a heck of a lineup for this book. It's an incredible lineup. The Kickstarter was enthusiastic, which just proves that people are into this. But I love monsters of all kinds, and because after my grandmother got me involved in monsters, I read so deeply into the genre. That was my childhood, was reading horror and science fiction, and a bit of epic fantasy too, which has monsters in it. So monsters were like my friends growing up. And when James said, hey, let's do a whole anthology about monsters, I'm like, do you even have to ask?
So you immediately just jumped on board. You didn't pretend, oh, I didn't get that email, let me send you.
Oh, no. James has put together some pretty great anthologies, and we've known each other for a while too. So as soon as I got that email, as frustrated as I was for not being able to do the one I was planning, his pitch was so good. I'm like, yeah, of course I'm doing that. So, and that's the fun of this, because in the horror world, somebody will come up with a good idea, and maybe multiple people. But what really pleases us, is if I can't edit it, I sure as heck want to be in it. And that's the kind of vibe we get to play with these toys. And we know we can tap our friends, because all of our friends are weird, which for us is a high mark. So yeah, I was definitely right in there.
So how did this work? Did each of you get to pick whichever monster you wanted? Were there guidelines? Were there rules? Talk a little just about, I'm curious for sort of each of you. What you wrote, how you decided, how you approached this.
Well, there were guidelines. I won't go deep into them because, but, basically there are monsters that are in the public domain, and there are monsters that aren't. And I tend to be like, I've been in almost 100 anthologies. So when I go into something, and of course, monsters stop it. And, James is like the king of Kickstarter anthologies over here. So I was like, so in, but then I wanted to pick something really obscure that wasn't obvious. And I picked the Blob, but I know the Blob is not in public domain. So I was talking to a couple of my buddies, Richard and Sharon, and I was talking about, I want to do the Blob, but I don't know. And literally Sharon said, my title is The Noise, the Funk, the Blob, where the is DA. that kind of Bronx kind of way. And I was like, oh, I could do that. It's not the same as the Blob. So that's how the title came. It came from them and the connection into music. And I wanted to do it from the Blob point of view, because again, just wanted to do something different. So, you know, that was like where I started with the story, and did a whole lot of crazy research, which I won't get into right now, because maybe we'll talk about that kind of thing later. But that's what I did with the Blob, DA.
I think I had to beg James to do a Dracula story because it was such a popular character.
Yeah.
But I wanted so much to have Dracula come to the Old West. And I wanted to pair him off against Sitting Bull and Custer during the time, or Sitting Bull and Buffalo Bill during the time that Buffalo Bill had his Wild West shows. Because I'm thinking, well, you know, vampires, you know, are indestructible, except they can't stand a chance against Indian wooden arrows. But really I wanted to do the story because I saw a picture of bat flies, these little creepy bugs that inhabit bats. I said, wow, Dracula's got bat flies. I just got to do this story having full of bugs. So it's so much fun to team up with these elder statements because, you know, Buffalo Bill and both Sitting Bull knew that their lifestyle was on the verge of being extinct. The Old West was gone, the buffaloes were gone, and here's Dracula, you know, coming to America as a rich hunter, but he wasn't hunting buffalo because they were all gone. He was hunting people because he wanted to taste Indians before they were all gone. So it was a nice combination, allowed me to play with some of my favorite characters, and it was fascinating. The stuff I came across while doing the research just made the story that much more fun.
Cool. Rena?
I had just finished watching, oddly enough, I just finished watching this documentary called the Chinese Diva Mummy, or the Diva Mummy of China. And it was about this mummy that they found that was almost perfectly preserved. And then I had heard from James, gotten an email, and he's like, hey, would you be interested? And I saw Mummy on the list, and I knew immediately that I wanted to do the mummy story, something about the Chinese diva mummy, and put my little twist on it. And I'm a huge fan of weird fiction, so I had to, of course, throw that in there too. So that was how my idea came out.
For me, I wanted to do Island of Dr. Moreau. It was actually the second novel I ever bought with my own money. First one being Conan the Wanderer, which was actually on the bookshelf above me. So when I was a kid, I read Island of Dr. Moreau. It's actually what got me into science fiction, because from there I went to all of H.G. Wells stuff and Jules Verne and then elsewhere, and was very surprised that there hadn't been more done with Moreau. Surprised Wells didn't, but that's one of the things about the classic writers. They did a book and they moved on to the next book. Nowadays, there'd be such pressure on them, such demand from devoted readers to do a sequel or a series or whatever. And I always wanted more Dr. Moreau stories. And I've seen the Charles Lawton version of it, which is pretty great. I saw the Burt Lancaster version of it, which had Barbara Carrera in it. So at least I liked something. And then the version of it with oh God, what's his name? Marlon Brando. And weirdly, I think I'm one of the only people in the world that like that movie, but I'm not sure why I like it. It's probably because I'm just hungry for a Moreau story, and each interpretation went in a slightly different way. So they're reimagining and expanding on it. And, I thought it'd be fun to take that idea and move it a little forward. Also, it deals with eugenics, which is something that I have written about in some of my thrillers. And I know the Nazis were very much into the master race program to create a perfect, people. And I thought, well, that's just calling to me to write a story set, using those different elements. I've already done the research. And I just, it gave me a reason to reread the book and then also listen to it again on audio and just dive back into why I loved that story in the first place. So Island of Dr. Moreau was always one of my favorites. And this was actually, even though I get invited to a lot of tie-in anthologies, for some reason I hadn't gotten around to doing something that's technically been on my bucket list since I started fiction. So thanks, James.
You're welcome.
Well, and pretty much all of you sort of brought up this idea, but monsters they're not metaphors exactly. There's no precise one-to-one for what any of these creatures mean or represent. But they are emblematic of so many ideas. They represent so much, and some of that's changed over time, some of it hasn't. And just talk a little about, because there is a way of reading into these stories and these creatures in so many different ways that sort of invites a lot of rethinking and retelling of these stories.
Well, I will start by saying that, when I started watching these Chiller Theater when I was younger, it didn't scare me so much as I was really deeply curious about the power that they had, the pain that they had. Almost all the monsters had some kind of mix of power and pain. And why? Because my life up until I was 18, I grew up in tough neighborhoods. My home was not safe. So there was nothing in these movies that could compare to me to what was real life. So they were such a wonderful escape for me. And I actually connected a lot to the monsters, to Frankenstein, which was heartbreaking to me before they even tried to make it too heartbreaking, to the Mummy, even to the Blob, which is the reason I picked it, is because I'm a big sci-fi, I'm a big science fan. So the idea of being able to have this creature, like this life form way out in space, drawn to Earth, why would that happen? And the first article I read when I was just kind of zooming around was this sound from Earth, this rhythm that they couldn't explain. And I was like, yes, didn't know how it was going to come together, but did. So, it's more the power and the inherent pain in monsters that connected for me young, because I had no power, but I had pain in my real life. So it was kind of, I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's what's in my head.
Actually, it makes sense to me because I grew up in a very similar situation. Bad neighborhood. My father was a career criminal and a child abuser, and my sisters and I were abused. So we had a monster at home. One of the reasons I liked watching monster stories and reading monster books is because they, I was not one of those kids that loved the monster. I tended to love the monster hunter, the Van Helsings. And, I love to be to read stories or watch movies where the monster could and eventually would be defeated. That to me gave me a kind of hope, even if I wasn't as consciously aware of it as a kid, it was definitely there. But, as I grew in my understanding of monsters, they fell into, for me, three categories. There are the sympathetic monsters, Frankenstein's monster being an example. He's totally a victim. Frankenstein, the scientist, is definitely the monster of that story. The creature was not. And the Bride of Frankenstein, especially as played in the movie, imagine what it would be like to wake up and you're now this thing. The instant PTSD, instant deep trauma, that character woke up and was driven mad in the moment. That's a sympathetic thing. You can feel empathy toward that. Gorgo, my favorite giant monster film, won and should have, because her baby had been captured and she's like, oh, hell no, stomps London flat, takes the baby and goes. So that's one category. Then there's the ones like the Blob they're no more evil or good than a storm. They are a fact of nature. It exists. And those are interesting because there is no way in which you can reason with it. And it's just there. And the third being the pernicious monsters that are deliberate in what they do. And those are the ones I intensely dislike. I like writing about them, but from the point of view of people fighting them. So I do like all three categories of monsters, and I like playing in them. For this, when this project came along, I wanted to go with situation where the monsters were not the evil creatures in the story. The humans who are in the story are the monsters of my story. And that became fun to switch it around because, let's face it, Nazis, not the best people that we've ever, had. And, a group of Nazis trying to use the technology of Dr. Moreau to create a legion of monstrous super soldiers. That's not a sympathetic cause. So I had a little fun building that story in with those guys as the actual monsters.
What always drew me with monsters wasn't so much like the fear of them, but the sense that some of them were so utterly alone that they were one of a kind. You know, I grew up as an only child in the country, had no companions, no playmates. I mean, life was really boring. If I wanted to play catch, I threw a ball up in the air and caught it. I mean, it really sucked. So I associated with Frankenstein because he was alone. He didn't ask to be created. He was terribly alone. And even when they made a bride for him, she rejected him. The creature from the Black Lagoon could have been the very last creature of its species. I mean, it was alone. There wasn't a little one running around. There wasn't a mate. And my first novel, Crota, was inspired by that. I had the creature wake up, and it's the last of its kind. It's utterly alone. And just that loneliness comes through in a lot of the stories of the classic monsters. They're usually one of a kind. They're very much alone. The Hunchback is alone. He has no one that he can associate with. That always tugged at my heartstrings. If these were alone, not by choice, it's just, you know, that's the way it was for him.
I think for me, the monsters represented something that everyone else could get together and be against, instead of having the focus on me. Here was something else that somebody was even more horrified of, you know, per se. And then also, I guess sometimes I've gotten reviews where people said that in some of my writing, I'm kind of tend to be romantic. So that was one of the reasons why The Mummy also stuck out to me, because I always thought of it as sort of a romantic story, you know, and then my twist on that ends up being something totally different than your traditional romance. But
well, and I was talking about this before, just before this when we were talking, but there's monster stories and there's horror stories. And I think a lot of readers and a lot of people here think of you as horror writers. But there's a lot of overlap between these two kinds of stories, but they are very different. And I'm just curious, I mean, talk a little about what that means and sort of how you see those differences.
Well, let me jump on that one, because I had actually a challenge with that, because I wanted it to have a horror element to the story, but there are two groups of characters within the story. For one, it's a horror story. The bad guys, it's their horror story. For, you know, the good guys in the story, they're the monsters, but they're in a different type of story. It's not a horror story to them. And so you have the monsters in their own monster story. They're the protagonists of their monster story. You have the Nazis who are in a horror story, and they're the horror in their horror story. And I had a little fun tweaking that model and playing with it both ways. But, you know, not all monsters are scary. I never thought Gorgo was scary. I never thought Frankenstein's monster was scary. I empathize too much with the poor guy. Godzilla, you know, last of his kind again. And, you know, bring my little Godzilla statue back again. I felt bad for Big G, you know, because he's the last of his kind. And, you know, he was either created by or awakened by nuclear bombs dropping in Japan, depending on which version of the movie. He woke up and they're the monster. They did this to him. So, you know, a little revenge, you can kind of see it. I guess a horror story doesn't necessarily require a sense of justice to it, where a monster story often does, because depending on where your definition of monster is and where the characters fall in their own definition of monstrous, is it something in them or something they're facing? But horror doesn't require justice. You know, it requires a lot of other wonderful elements, but not justice. For me, monster stories require some degree of justice.
I love what you just said, Jonathan, about the justice. I never really thought in those terms. When I was doing my Blobs story, as I said, I wanted to do it from the Blobs point of view, because you never get that in the various versions of the movie that have been created. And I rewatched them all because I didn't want to trust my memory anyway. I mean, whoa. There's a later version that's like, okay, that was a choice. But I went to the early one, or the first ones, because those are the ones that caught me. And to do the story, when you talk about horror, I mean, we've all talked about this in the past, that it's an emotion. So you can have a sense of horror in a romance story or in a fantasy. It's not a difference. But for me in this story, I wanted the the blob's point of view, which is almost incomprehensible in some ways, right? Because it's not human. But I try to do that by its need and the connection to sound and music. And then the humans, you know, yeah, it wasn't good for some of them, but but there's a musician in the story that's having a great kind of connection to it. So again, because the blob was inspired by this pulsation, this actual real pulsation from Earth that they don't really know what it is, then I was able to connect it to the humans through this music band. But then there's there's stuff happening in there with other humans, and I don't know what the scare level is. Somebody else would have to tell me since I wrote it, but I know it's there in that sense of human versus the blob's point of view.
Now, with with monster stories, even though they're horrific and they have elements of terror in them, I've always considered them pure escape fiction for the simple fact we know that werewolves supposedly don't exist, that zombies don't exist, that Godzilla is not going to come in your backyard and stomp you flat. So I can read it and still know that the terror is not going to affect me, because you can turn it off. Because when you get too scared with a monster story, you can go, hey, wait, there's no Dracula. It's okay. The mummy doesn't really come to life and stalk at night. So you got that element, that safety bar that you can grab onto. Whereas if you read something like Jack Ketchum's The Girl Next Door or go to see Terrifier 2, you don't have that safety bar, because you're like, oh my God, this could be real, or this is real. So, that's more disturbing to me. It's more horrific, the stuff that can be true.
Yeah, I agree. And in my story, it's hard to, there's like a line between the monsters, they're actually the humans, because they betrayed my character twice, once in the past and then now in the future, or in the present time. And the monsters aren't really who you think, and then the monsters that are actually the monsters in the story are they care for my main character and they love her. So that's sort of the twist with that one. You're not really sure who to root for.
James, any thoughts?
I think the anthology really did a good job of having all of these different like flavors of horror and monster stories, because I didn't tell any of the writers like do it this way or do it that way. So I was like, here's your monster and interpret it however you want. So I think we have the monster stories, which I think a monster story is more, you're probably focusing more on the monster than on the horror. And the horror stories, you're focusing on the horror. And so we have prequels, there are sequels, some people it was just kind of based on or inspired by. So it's really an eclectic collection of these monster stories. So I think you're going to see it in every type of interpretation. I mean, I've seen some reviews where people didn't like that. They just wanted like everything to be like one kind of way. But I like the idea of being able to see it in all these different variations. So, I mean, if that's what you're into, then the anthology is certainly something for you. But I think you'll see that in the book. I think you'll see all these different type of takes, and you'll see the monster stories done in every possible way, where some of them are very sympathetic to the monster. Sometimes the monster is a real monster, where it's like, there's some kind of evil force behind it, and there's no like humanity or consciousness behind it. And yeah, so like that's what I like to do with an anthology. I don't like to give too many guidelines or instructions. I just like kind of go and do what you want to do, and that's why I didn't assign any of the monsters either, because it's like, like John said, he wants to do a Dr. Moreau. I don't know that, so if I turn to John and say like, hey, can you give me a Frankenstein story? He might be like, okay, but I've had like this Dr. Moreau story cooking in my mind all this time, so I just rather like I mean, that's why I choose like really great writers, because it's like you guys do what you want to do. That way, there's not as much pressure on me. So just get really good writers and just say, hey, do what you want to do, and then I just put it all together.
Appreciate you, James, for that. I'm in two of your anthologies, two of them, and I appreciate that you give enough so there's a sense of your vision for the anthology, but not so much that we can't create what we want. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, so do I'm actually doing another monster story for him, but for an anthology that's not a monster anthology, the Shakespeare anthology. I'm doing, a Tempest story with Caliban, and because you didn't tell us what to write, you opened the door for, what is true artistic creativity, artistic vision. We get the seed, but we decide, what's going to grow from it, and that's always a lot of fun, both as a contributor and an anthologist. So bravo.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting too, as an editor, when the story comes in, because I don't know what the hell it's going to be. So it's like, oh, well, let me see what what they did with it, and it's usually really cool. So like, whenever they give me their ideas, it's like, that's a great idea. I love that. So I mean, I like to approach it too as a fan and a reader. So it's very cool to get to read the story. Be the first person to read the story, and the first person also to hear the idea. And it's like, oh, that's a great idea. And so just putting the anthologies together, because this is my first anthology, and they are a lot of fun to do.
Well, Jonathan, I'm going to be thinking about that idea that monster stories have some degree of justice, because I do really like that. And I kept thinking of Matheson's I Am Legend and the ending, where he kind of plays with that idea.
Richard Matheson gave me a copy of that for Christmas when I was 13. And I reread I Am Legend every year. And it is an incredible book because it has so many different interpretations of what's going on. And it is both horror, actually it's horror, science fiction, it's post-apocalyptic, dystopian, and a moral tale and social satire in a little thin book. And it's books like that that have inspired so many of us. We read, one of these classic books, or, we've all seen movies and TVs, but, we're all writers, so we read. And we see what others have done with it. And the difference between us and readers say, oh, that's really cool. And we're like, oh, I wonder what I would have done with it, or wonder what I can do with it. And our minds are always looking for that little bit of the opportunity to grow something new and weird. But we do like playing with old stuff as well. The inspirations are never that far behind us. They're always kind of whispering in our ears.
I mean, that's all the truth, right? You can hear from just the few handful of us that are in the anthology. Everyone here did something very different with the monster that they worked with. But at the same time, I've read your work. It's amazing, your stories. And at the same time, it's not like incomprehensible to be in contact with what the inspiration was. So.
Yeah, I want one little quick note here. Having read so much of everyone else's work and having heard what you guys are saying on this panel, it's fun to me to see the process of taking a known thing and then filtering it through the individual creativity experience and so on of each of the writers here, because we're all from different backgrounds and different parts of the country and different preferences, and turning out stories that are incredibly readable and fun, and yet not so personal that we can't get what the reader has in mind, or the writer has in mind. There, the job and a blob story and all the other stories that you guys have done, you kind of go in expecting, okay, it's going to be a story about this, it's going to be a story about, about Dracula, and I've read a million, and then you read the story and you see that, no, I haven't read that. I have not read that version of it. And that's what made this book so much fun to read, even though I also wrote for it. I just loved reading these different takes and being surprised by them.
It's wonderful. Every story in here is just fabulous. And it's a different slant, it's a different approach. Loved them all.
Well, and recently, we've had this sort of long period of zombies have kind of been the monster of the moment. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that sociologically and otherwise. And though I think post-COVID, to the degree we are post-COVID, I think zombies hit a little differently. So I'm just kind of curious, what do you think, what do you want the next monster to be? Which can also be because you think it's relevant or because you just want to write it. So you can take that either way.
Nobody's jumping in on that one.
That's a hard question. I've always said the biggest monsters are de-evolved humans. So
I think there's a lot can be done with skinwalkers, with the shapeshifters, because there's a lot of legends, especially in North America, about the skinwalkers, and people believe it. I mean, I'm talking about, you know, tearing off the fur side and flipping it, becoming human, and blending in with other people. I know just about every native tribe in this country has stories about shapeshifters and skinwalkers. So it's a wide open thing. There's so much can be done with that, both in stories and in movies.
and not just in this country, Al. Like I like reading fables of other, countries, and you see that a lot. This idea of being able to change form and look like someone who's innocent but be really dangerous. I think that concept, I like it. I could play with that.
Yeah. And kind of going in that same direction, I've always been a fan of folklore. I mean, the thing that got me involved in writing horror fiction is I'd written a nonfiction book on monster folklore, kind of as a thank you to my grandmother for getting me involved in all this stuff. And I've written, a total of 6 books now on nonfiction books on supernatural folklore. I would love to see more of folkloric versions of monsters rather than the Hollywood versions that we've seen so often. I mean, the versions of vampires, the versions of werewolves and so on that we see in movies, a lot of that was created by movie makers and novelists. They are not necessarily representative of the folklore. And with things like skinwalkers and Wendigo and so many other, in this country and in countries around the world, there are versions of monsters I've never seen in fiction. And they're so cool and weird and scary and creepy. Like the Vietnamese vampire that's basically a head that pulls itself out of the body, its head and entrails floating around. Why is that not a movie? That ticket right now, and so on. So folkloric monsters, I think, is the deepest possible well we have for being able to come up with monsters none of the readers will have seen. And I love being able to have a reader come to something thinking they know what's going to go on, and then not at all knowing what the hell's going on as the story is unfolding. That's going to be fun.
I agree. I agree with Jonathan. The folklore is really like the next big wave, and even if it's fictional folklore, it's still something different, and it may be in that folklore style. Like just some stories that I recently read that I don't think they're actual folklore. They could be, but I believed it. If it was, it sounded real to me. But I think that's really hot right now.
I just did a story with a Filipino vampire, which also leaves half its body behind. And I also did one with a Mexican one, which I can't pronounce, but the Filipino was Aswang. And my wife's from the Philippines, so she's always telling me these stories, and they still believe it down there. I remember a couple of years ago, they had voting was canceled because the villagers were scared to leave their huts because an Aswang was flying around and terrorizing people. But little stuff like that, those little tidbits make great stories, and they haven't been overplayed.
Yeah, well, I mean, look at what happened in Malawi. I think it was 10 or 15 years ago, where some of the people from the World Health Organization were murdered by the locals for being vampires because they were coming and taking blood and so on. And their vampire beliefs are very, very strong there. So what people who are not from Malawi thought was, this horrible crime against these good intentioned, scientists, from the perspective of people living there, they just defeated monsters. So, that's one of the fun things about folklore is not just writing about the monster, but getting inside the head of the people who believe that monster, it's part of their culture. And look at, the 4 writers here. We're all different. We're different races, different cultures, different backgrounds. If we did 50 anthologies in a row and each editor gave us basically the same prompt with as little interference as James does, each of us would come up with a complete different story for each. And that's what makes this fun to read and to write, because there is no end to the variety of storytelling, especially if you're tapping into thousands of years of cultural growth and expansion, and also not just the stuff that we outsiders know about a culture, the stuff that the people inside the culture know that nobody else knows but them. That sort of stuff is gold when it comes to storytelling.
Y'all making my heart race over here because I'm like, I want to go and see what's like a monster in Africa that no one's ever talked about. I want to write that, and I literally need a clone to finish the deadlines I have on my table.
Well, I love that. Omar, I mean, did you have questions that you wanted to get to?
Yeah. Sorry, wasn't ready there. Yeah, let's see. Jamie Kura has asked for Jonathan, Mayberry, and other panelists, if they'd like, what were some of your favorite folkloric monsters your grandmother introduced you to?
Oh, that one's easy for me because I've written so much about this monster. It's the Benedante. It's a legend from Italy about werewolves who at night people would turn into werewolves at night and then go fight evil. So they were not monsters. And a couple of the people, and these are legends going back to Etruscan times, by the way. And nowadays in Italy, these Benedante are actually kind of like Wiccan. They'll come and bless and sage your house and so on. But for hundreds of years, they were werewolves fighting monsters. And I did a whole series of short stories about a character who's descendant from Benedante. He's a werewolf, private investigator, but when he takes on a client, they essentially become part of his pack, and he'll do anything to protect his pack. And it's fun writing those types of werewolf stories because they don't follow any of the rules about, full moon and silver and all that. None of that was in folklore anyway. So I'm able to retell just werewolf stories, but at the same time, relying on or building on a werewolf subtype that is just not well known, but is extremely cool. And so the Benedante, meaning good walkers, is my favorite of folklore. And by the way, one guy who had been arrested by the Inquisition and tortured they wanted him to confess that he was actually serving the devil. They couldn't break him. One of these guys who claimed to be a Benedante, they finally released the guy and even gave him kind of a nickname. And it's in church records, the Hound of God, which I thought was the coolest damn nickname. I would have that tattooed. I just think it's a great bit of folklore, and I love that one.
I like that, the hound you said of God?
The Hound of God, yeah.
Okay, writing that down. I'm not saying nothing.
For me, it's ghost stories, probably. Like in Thai, they're called V. And one of the more famous ones, Enoch, is a story that my mom always used to tell me. So for me, definitely in Thai culture, it's mostly ghost stories. And a lot of people believe that they're real, so they're not really like fiction.
I've always been fascinated by tales of the little people. I grew up listening to stories about that. I mean, the Cherokees talk about the little people up in the hills in North Carolina. Franklin County, there's supposed to be caves that appear to be man-made, but they're not big enough for you to stand up in. And there's little tools that were used that they found that wouldn't fit a normal person's hands. Lakota people, I got friends who do the Sundance every year, and they talk about a valley out there that people won't go into because it's called the Valley of the Little People. And they stay away from it because they're scared of them. Here in Florida, at Lake Wales, there was an incident happened back in the 50s where somebody trapped a little person in a trap in their orchard because something was getting into the oranges, and it was a little man, and they called the police and they took it away. And the next night, these little figures come out of the woods and started throwing oranges at the house. They contacted the police and brought it back, and there's actually police records of this. They brought it back and turned it loose so that it all calmed down again. But I've always been fascinated by the little people because they're all over the country stories. And when the Vikings first came here, they talked about the little people. So it's not just a one remote sighting, it's everywhere that's been seen.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I didn't get stories from my grandparents, but what I did get is I grew up in Philly, but I would go down south to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and my grandparents on my father's side had a farm. And so the first time I saw a bottle tree, I was like, what is that? And what it is they're bottles, empty bottles on the ends of tree branches. And the story behind it is that they capture spirits, haints, whatever, who are wandering kind of lost. So they get drawn to the sound of the bottles, and then they get captured inside the bottles. And then when the sun comes up, they get to move on to where they're supposed to be. I have used that concept in way too many things, as you know, Jonathan, in one of the things I did for you.
Yep.
I was just like fascinated by that. So I got that sort of by my grandmother, just because.
Oh, and by the way, Al, real quick, I don't know if you know about I think it's the Ubugogu. I think that's the name. In one of the, I think it's in Southeast Asia. I'm totally blanking on where this was, but they actually found skeletons of little people where there had been legends of them for hundreds of years. They nicknamed them the Hobbits,
Wow.
Night out. But they were a pretty savage little bunch. But they were actually really short. And it was an area that they found so many bones now that it's proving that they existed. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm not a panelist, but I just want to add that I got ghost stories from my grandmother about ghosts and demon possessions because her father was a curandero in Puerto Rico. So I grew up hearing that stuff. Now speaking of terror, Brian Anderson asks, which monster strikes true terror in your heart?
Man, humans, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Everything that's happened in our true history with Nazis, with slavery, with everything, where humans decided, even to this day, in countries where humans decide that a whole nother group of humans were less than them and they could kill them. Sorry, I got nothing for you there in the classic monster concept.
Yeah, man is the only creature on the earth that hunts and kills for pleasure. I mean, animals don't do it. I mean, so mankind scares the tar out of me. If I want to get scared, I watch the evening news.
Yeah, I want to going with you on that, because evil to me is a human concept. I don't believe in demons. I don't believe in the supernatural versions of evil, but I have seen it firsthand in real people. That is the scariest thing for me. And the scariest monsters I've created in my books are usually the real people who their worldview has skewed so much that what they're doing they feel is correct. And that's even more frightening when this is someone who didn't wake up and say, hey, I want to be a supervillain. They think that what they're doing is right. And to look in their eyes and see that certainty is terrifying. And also see the pleasure in the eyes that they get from being able to express this darkness as correct.
Speaking of the human world, Anna says, the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires had a really interesting modern take on vampires and made interesting use of social commentary in the story, and actually even as a horror element itself. What do you think of social commentary? What do you think social commentary is going to look like in modern horror going forward?
Well, I don't think it's something you have to force. I'm sorry, Jonathan, if you want to.
No, please.
I mean, I work with, I mentor younger writers, and I don't mean young in age, like young in how long they've been writing and so forth. And in areas that, they're Black, they're what, they're blah, 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 all that other stuff. And they're always, not always, but often we have a conversation about how to reflect that social point of view that you feel. And what I tell them is you don't have to think about it consciously. It's going to come through the story if you're writing from your authentic feelings. So that's how I do it. I've never sat down necessarily, although the other Terrors anthology that Rena's one of the awesome editors of, has a theme that sort of asks you to look at yourself as other and react, but I've never had to do that. It's always just been, from my authentic reactions emotionally to things. It comes through no matter what I'm writing.
Yeah, I agree with Linda on that. I mean, everything I've ever written has something, I'm saying something in there. Sometimes you might have to look a little bit harder, and sometimes it's right in your face, but everything I've ever written has something.
Well, Well, I always try to do like the oral storytellers. I try to weave in a little bit of teaching or social commentary with the story. That way you're not hitting at people over the head with it, which is why several of my novels are used down at the Orange County Correctional Facility for the Youthful Offender Program. For many times, for many of these kids, they've never read a book before, but they'll read a book, even though I'd have horrific scenes of death and mayhem in there, but they're getting the stuff in between the lines, and they're getting like, respect your elders, respect the land, and I've been there several times talking to these kids who are in for armed robbery and murder and things like that. And they got so much out of these stories. It's just a shame somebody didn't get to them 5-10 years earlier. But they picked up what I was trying to do, which is how my ancestors used to do. They used to put the teachings in an oral story, throw it out there. If you didn't get the teachings, you didn't deserve to have it.
Yeah. Going into storytelling with the idea of proselytizing or preaching too much, that's the kind of thing that shows. But if you're drawing on experiences, drawing on insight, drawing on empathy, you can get and you can touch on social commentary elements without it being a primer on this belief system. You see that a lot, and other writers have explored that too. Some of the writers who have written some of the more frightening vampire stories clearly get that in the pre-romanticized version of vampires, they, in a lot of ways, they're essentially rapists. They are taking what someone does not want by force, and different variations that are explored in certain people's certain writers' approach to vampirism. You mentioned zombies. A lot of Alex mentioned zombies, but a lot of what's in the better zombie stories are about being the other. Whether it's the thing you're fighting or the thing that you are suddenly being viewed as, one minute you know what they are, next minute they are not that. Your family member becomes a zombie. That's a different thing. What does it mean if that happens? Do you hate them? Or do you fight them and defend yourself, but grieve for the person who has now become transformed? There's a lot of elements of social commentary that can play into fiction. The best stuff is the stuff that doesn't say, hey, look, social commentary, but brings it in and does it in a way that doesn't force the reader to stand with one particular point of view, but rather offers choices for them to look at the circumstances and form their own opinion. It becomes a conversation rather than just a book.
I think that's a great note. Omar, do you have any closing? Because or are we about out of time?
Yeah, we're drawing to a close now. So if you all want to wrap up.
Oh, well, I just want to say thank you again to everyone for coming out. Thank you to our great panelists, who, as I said before, I've read you all. I love you in the new anthology, which everyone should pick up. And I'm glad that we had the opportunity to do that. Thank you for our strange.
Don't want to be left out here.
Everyone get the book. For coming out to our strange corner of New England, in some form or another, which feels very haunty, kind of unreal. This kind of fits with the season, but thanks for coming out.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Pleasure with my buddies.
And James, again, thank you for inviting us to your book.
Oh man.
Thank you, James.
Yes, thank you,
Yes,
James.
right.
Real James. You my hero.
Wow. All right.
All right. Well, everyone, have a good night. I would say drive safe, but no one's driving.
No. Good night,
Bye.
everyone.
All
Uh,
right.
Bye.